All right, today I want to talk about the feast that everybody is looking forward to. That is on the lips, hearts, and minds of everyone because it's the next feast, the Day of Atonement. So I want to begin by reading Leviticus 23, starting at verse 27. And 26 said, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, so in verse 27, also the 10th day of the 7th month shall be the Day of Atonement. It shall be a holy convocation for you. You shall afflict your souls and offer an offering made by fire to the Lord. And you shall do no work on that same day, for it is the Day of Atonement, to make atonement for you before the Lord your God. For any person who is not afflicted in soul on that same day shall be cut off from his people. Verse 30, and any person who does any work on that same day, that person I will destroy from among his people. You shall do no manner of work. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. It shall be to you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and you shall afflict your souls. And it goes on to state from evening to evening. So these scriptures tells us that we are commanded to afflict our souls on the Day of Atonement. And for Jews nowadays, this day is the holiest day of the year for them. They call it Yom Kippur. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we afflict our souls? So the word that means afflict, translated, is honor. It's Strong's 6031, if you want to check it out. What does it mean? It means to find oneself in a stunted, humble, lowly position. It means to be humbled, to make yourself low. It means to be bowed down. It means to put down oneself. Traits that normally we in this modern world don't practice. We are always seeking to get ahead, to compete, to win, to be successful. But God commanded us to afflict our souls, to be humble, to be bowed down, to become low. And he even said, he who refuses to afflict his soul on that day will be cut off. Why does one have to afflict oneself on the Day of Atonement? And the reason is to have the right attitude that God desires of us when we undertake the fast. So if we don't have that attitude, the fast would be meaningless. And the benefits that God expects us to derive from it, we wouldn't get any benefit from it. I know we prepare for the Day of Atonement. When I was younger, I used to eat plenty the day before the Day of Atonement. Alejandro does that still. And during the Day of Atonement, I remember thinking about all the food that I wasted. Going home in Mr. Blackman's car, watching people selling food on the side of the road, and a mind consumed with food. So that was my experience growing up in church and having to fast from a young age. But just as we prepare to fast physically, we have to prepare to afflict our souls spiritually. So I just want to offer 3 points to help us to learn to afflict our souls and prepare for the next feast day. First one engage in spiritual self-examination. When we do this, it allows us to become more Christ-like in our thoughts, actions, deeds. Galatians chapter 6, verses 3 to 4 tells us, sobering words. If anyone thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself or herself. But let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone and not in another. So we ought to undertake self-examination. True self-examination allows us to see the real state, spiritual state that we are in. Christ himself warned us, in Matthew chapter 7, he said to remove the log in our eye before we take out the speck in our brother's eyes, because he knows that that is human practice. We could see a speck in someone else's eyes, but we cannot see that big log and beam in our own eye. He labeled those people hypocrites, and he had some very choice words for hypocrites. When we read Matthew and read the account in the four Gospels. So if we do not self-examine critically and look at ourselves introspectively, we are hypocrites. This examination will help us realize how dependent we are on God for his mercy on a daily basis, because when we see our true self, we would know that it is only through God's mercy that we are enjoying life and blessings. Once we do a proper self-examination, there's only one recourse, and that is to humble ourselves. After true self-examination, you realize you have to humble yourself. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 to 6 tells us, likewise, you younger people, submit yourselves to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility. Why? For God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And self-examination will make us realize that we need God's grace. And if we need God's grace, we have to be humble. Therefore, verse 6, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. Repenting and humbling ourselves before God allows the relationship we have with our Father to become stronger as we learn to depend on him totally. And God would not resist us if we have a humble attitude, an afflicted attitude. We will come to realize that our state of sinfulness requires God's grace for us to dwell in his presence and to be called. Afflicting ourselves requires us to shed all thoughts of self-importance and grandeur. It requires us to put on the mind of Christ. And Philippians reminds us of that. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition, verse 3, or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. And we could read the rest of that chapter as we prepare to afflict our souls for the Day of Atonement. The third point, pray to align ourselves with the will of God. Christ set the perfect example of this in Luke 22, verses 41 to 42. in verse 41. And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and he then knelt down and prayed, verse 42, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. If we are to become low and humbled, we have to allow God's will to dominate our entire lives. Not just a few parts, not the parts that we allow him access to, but our entire being. God must dominate. His will must be done in all aspects of our lives. So honor, afflicting, requires total submission to God, that low state of mind. Romans chapter 12, verses 1 to 2 tells us, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So we ought to be striving to do God's will. God must dominate all aspects of our lives. So in order to totally align ourselves to God, we must totally conform to him, his teachings, and value this calling that he has given us. We must empty ourselves of our selfish desires, and this would allow total submission to God. So I know we have been preparing months now for the Feast of Tabernacles, ensuring that all plans are perfect, ensuring by now that travel plans, hotel plans, food plans are in place. But let's use the few hours we have left to prepare for one of God's holiest days, the Day of Atonement. We prepare physically. You might do like Alejandro and eat about 4 times tomorrow, drink lots of water. But I encourage us to start preparing spiritually for the feast, the holy day of atonement. So as a reminder, let's prepare to engage in spiritual self-examination. Let's prepare to humble ourselves before God. And let's prepare to align ourselves with the will of God, not allowing our will to dominate, but humbling ourselves, afflicting our souls, becoming lowly before God. God stated that he who doesn't afflict his soul will be cut off. Brethren, let's strive to afflict our souls on the Day of Atonement.